meeting number 133 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, May 23, 2024, the committee is resuming its study of the trade impacts of Canada's leadership in reducing emissions. We have with us today from the Aluminum Association of Canada, Jean Simard, President and Chief Executive Officer by video conference, the Canadian Climate Institute, Dave Sawyer, Principal Economist, and from the Canadian Labour Congress, Elizabeth Kwan, Senior Researcher. Welcome to you all. We will start with opening remarks. Mr. Simard, I invite you to take the floor for up to 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Canada's raw aluminum industry is located in Quebec and British Columbia. It produces 3.2 million tons of aluminium with one of the lowest carbon footprints in the world. We have always supported carbon pricing mechanisms in Canada, including Quebec's cap-and-trade system, known as SPED in Quebec, and British Columbia's taxation mechanism. We recognize the value of the federal system, albeit we aren't subject to it, as our activities are fully covered by the provincial systems that I have just mentioned. The federal system does remain the obligatory reference for provincial systems, which are measured against it in order to ensure equivalence within their jurisdictions. It is also the only reference employed by the foreign country carbon border adjustment mechanisms to calibrate, upon arrival, foreign-sourced products on their import markets. These systems do not recognize any jurisdiction other than state jurisdiction. Our reduced footprint is a considerable competitive advantage in a world that is rapidly and increasingly moving towards decarbonization, as is true in America and in Europe. This competitive advantage, however, does not immediately materialize with the introduction, let's say, of the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, better known by its acronym CBAM, given that currently, CBAM recognizes only Scope 1 emissions from industrial processes. Given that industry worldwide tends to use the same processes, they all have the same scope. But only when Scope 2 emissions, those from the energy source, are taken into account does our specific competitive advantage related to our energy source become obvious. It's also worth noting that, apart from small volumes of exports to Europe, over 90%, so the bulk, of our exports are into the United States. And it seems likely that the American market will not set up a similar mechanism in the near future. Therefore, we face competition from parts of the world that don't have domestic carbon pricing and who don't have the additional costs associated with such requirements. In our case, we've already been internalizing the requirements of this market dynamic since 2013, and we assume maintenance of the existing system in Canada. These are fundamental elements of our competitive analysis and game plan. The existing mechanism, through the equivalence required of provincial mechanisms, remains our incentive for maintaining reductions over the long term, which is a good thing, we think. In closing, we'd like to emphasize the paradox that the aluminum industry here in Canada now faces and that we ask you at least, to take into account. While carbon pricing must be maintained for the reasons set out above, our low carbon footprint is testimony to the considerable challenges we face, unlike our competitors elsewhere in the world who face the challenge of energy transition, let's say from coal or natural gas to renewable energies. We face an industrial transition on an unprecedented scale, consisting of developing and implementing on an industrial scale, then, disruptive technologies that are still in R&D that change the way aluminium is produced in order to go from 2 to 0 tons of emissions. That's our aim. In the evolution of the Canadian mechanism and related regulations, we need to find the balance that maintains our competitiveness recognizes our carbon advantage in terms of emissions levels while keeping us on a realistic trajectory of reduction over time, taking into account the time required to deploy and implement the new technologies. Thank you.
Mr. Simard, on to Mr. Sawyer for 5 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today. So my remarks will focus on the rising risks of border carbon adjustments, the role of Canadian carbon pricing systems or large emitter trading systems. They are trading markets after all, and they're designed to basically reduce costs through trading. So they're markets basically. And these systems are an effective shield, I'm going to argue, and there's a need for a stronger federal-provincial coordination to put our best foot forward and to coordinate basically action to minimize costs on industry and reduce risk. So about myself, so I'm the principal economist with the Canadian Climate Institute. I've run Enviroeconomics, a small consultancy, for decades. I'm a commissioner with the Canadian Carbon Competitiveness Commission, and I've worked with most governments on designing large industrial emitter systems, so I understand how they operate and what they're trying to do at a practical level. So BCAs are a growing risk to Canadian exports. So BCAs are rapidly reshaping global trade, as you've heard a lot. Mechanisms like the US CBAM, or excuse me, the EU CBAM and the US proposed Prove It Act all represent a growing trend towards linking climate policy and trade policy. While these measures aim to reduce carbon leakage and level the playing field, they present growing risks to Canada's very export-oriented economy. We do very well through open trade, don't we? Currently, so what do these risks look like? Currently under CBAM, we figure about $64 million in tariffs are likely to be levied against about three and change billion dollars of exports into the EU. So this is across 81 product groups, represents a cost increase of about 1.6% against the value of exports. And you know, it doesn't look like a significant risk now, but that risk jumps significantly with our roughly $30 billion in trade with the EU, raising potential costs if everything gets covered to about $1 billion in tariffs looking out into the future. So not small at all. The proposed U.S. Prove It Act could take an even broader perspective here by assessing the GHG intensity of a broader suite of commodities. We're looking at about 200 products, about 180 products listed in the bipartisan Prove It Act, covering about 30% of our trade or more. It's really hard to nail it down, but when you look at the product categories, it's about $30 billion in trade, and if the Prove It Act pushes forward, a lot of regulatory red tape on disclosing emission intensity for a big chunk of our exporters, including aluminum, crude, fertilizers, critical minerals, and importantly, the Act expands coverage to manufactured commodities. So not just the raw steel, but like the steel products, cement products, not just the raw clinker. So it's fairly significant in its scope. So this evolving landscape underscores the need for Canada to respond strategically, basically to protect the industries, maintain market access, reduce risks. So the large industrial emitter programs, the large emitter trading systems, are a shield against these tariffs. Despite these challenges, Canada has a significant advantage, these systems. Programs like Alberta's TIER program, the federal output-based pricing system, and all the provincial and territorial systems across the country are there, and they can protect against punitive charges. And so why are they a good shield? Well, first, these systems, federal, provincial systems, are designed to only impose a modest cost. We've done a whole bunch of work. You can look on our website and see what the average costs are for industry. They're not that significant. Happy to talk about that later. Yes, they're costs, but they're not off the charts. Second, many sectors benefit through saleable credits. These systems are designed to help the large emitters, so they're given generous credits, which are saleable. And in a lot of cases, industry is making more than they're having to pay. So it's not just a bad news story for everybody. And finally, they're reducing emissions. They're doing their job. Yes, they need tweaks. Yes, they can be improved, but it's a continuous improvement process we see rolling forward. So this balance between reducing emissions and maintaining competitiveness is a core strength of Canada's approach. And it's essential that foreign trading partners and policymakers in other countries come to understand what we're doing in a country with these programs. So I'm going to speak to federal-provincial policy coordination, how it can reduce the risk. So while the large emitter trading systems provide a strong foundation, there's more work to do. To maximize the effectiveness of these programs and mitigate the risks posed by the BCAs, Canada needs better coordinated action. I know we're in a federation and I know we're fragmented, but it's trade and industry. So what does that look like? So first, unified data and messaging. So the nuts and bolts of the systems, what does that look like? Governments have a role here to highlight that to our partners. Canada must present clear, consistent data about our systems and the costs industries are already paying. This helps trading partners understand what we're doing and the costs we're imposing.
If you could please close, Mr. Sawyer.
Yeah, okay, I'll close. So finally, thank you. So in closing, BCAs reflect a broader shift in global trade dynamics, linking climate policy with economic competitiveness. While these mechanisms present risks, Canada's large emitter systems are an effective shield. To fully capitalize on these risks and avoid these risks, and capitalize on the opportunities, we need more proactive engagement from industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kwan for 5 minutes, please.
Good afternoon, Chair, committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. I'm Elizabeth Kwan, Senior Researcher with the Canadian Labour Congress. I'm also the co-chair of the Canadian CIIT Domestic Advisory Group for Labour. The Canadian Labour Congress is the largest labour organization in Canada, bringing together dozens of national and international unions, provincial and territorial federations of labour, and community-based labour councils, and we represent more than 3 million workers in this country. I'm going to start, Chair, with 6 recommendations that I would like to present to the committee. First is that the government develop and implement a robust pro-worker industrial strategy and a Canadian Border Carbon Adjustment BCA mechanism as part of a broader strategy to build up Canada's industrial base, foster innovation, and create an environment where good unionized jobs can thrive. Second, that as part of this industrial strategy, the government strategically builds up a downstream economy that adds value to the production of goods, shifting away from exporting raw and semi-processed goods. Third recommendation is that the government actions and investments are established to support workers in labor force adjustment from the uncertainties of trade with the U.S. and the shift to a sustainable low-carbon economy. Fourth, that the government commits to accelerate establishing and implementing a Canadian BCA as a tool to level the playing field between Canada and other like-minded countries in trade and as one of the tools to reach Canada's climate targets. Fifth, that government publish what we heard report on the input from stakeholders from the 2021 consultation on BCAs no later than April the 1st, 2025. And lastly, that the government commits to developing a Canadian BCA mechanism that aligns with the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, and to conduct public stakeholder consultations on the new Canadian BCA mechanism in 2025. Chair, people across Canada and across the globe are experiencing the unprecedented impacts of climate change in their work and their everyday lives. Many countries around the globe are racing to transition to a low-carbon economy. Our economy must adapt and be positioned to take advantage of the massive industrial and economic opportunities that come with the global shift to a low-carbon economy. How do we take advantage of the current situation in the world of trade? As we all know, U.S. is Canada's top trading partner, accounting for 77% of total Canadian exports. However, there are many uncertainties that lie ahead for Canada's trade with the U.S., with threats of tariffs of 10 to 25% and a call to move quickly on the renegotiation of CUSMA. We also know that the new Trump administration will retreat from various climate change solutions. The response from Canada must be strong, and we must all work together to protect Canada's interests and clearly prioritize the interests of workers, their families, and their communities. At the same time, the European Union, with its 27 member states, is Canada's second largest trading partner. Since 2017, when CETA entered into force provisionally, the EU has enjoyed trade surpluses for goods, while Canada's trade has experienced trade deficits that continue to widen over time. And here is the opportunity to develop a robust industrial strategy that diversifies the economy, the Canadian trading partners, and includes a pro-worker agenda in the transition to a low-carbon economy more quickly. Having a border carbon adjustment mechanism is a trade tool to get us there. A BCA is a fair, predictable mechanism that keeps Canadian companies competitive and keeps good jobs in our community. As the co-chair of the Canadian CIIT Domestic Advisory Group for Labour, our EU counterparts have expressed to me their keen interest in clean products from Canada because of our high labour and environment standards. One of the immediate government priorities must be to urgently develop a Canadian BCA that aligns with the EU and UK CBAMs. This will open doors to more trade and more good-paying jobs. There is no doubt that a Canadian BCA will benefit Canada's trading relationship with EU, UK, and other like-minded low-carbon economies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. On to questions from the members. Mr. Martel for 6 minutes, please.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for being with us here today. Thank you as well for Mr. Simard for joining us. I've been able to meet with him a few times before. Very interesting work they're undertaking. Mr. Simard, you tell us regularly, I've often heard, that Canada is producing metal in a responsible way with a low carbon footprint, in fact, the lowest in the world. I'd like to know, Mr. Simard, what is the effect of the carbon tax on the competitivity of the aluminum industry here in Canada? Well, in our case, what you're referring to, I believe, is the Quebec carbon tax, and which, as I mentioned, we support. We support such pricing mechanisms, pricing carbon, which contribute considerably to reducing our greenhouse gases, our emissions, and makes us in the long term more competitive on the world market. Our industry has reduced by 36% its emissions, while it also doubled its capacity. So we're really a model company in matters of reducing emissions across Canada. Our 2020 targets, the 2020 targets set by Canada, we actually reached them before 2020. So we are quite comfortable with the current approach. In fact, when we compare ourselves to other markets, such as those of Europe, we see we really have an advantage here. Mr. Simard, the Minister of the Environment, is proposing an international tax on maritime shipping, which could have a negative effect on ports in Canada and also on key sectors such as that of aluminium. With international partners who are already reticent, do you think that this foreseeable initiative would keep people from investing in the regions that are producing Canadian aluminium? I don't think so, because our product goes into Europe, and most of it, as I say, 93% goes into the United States, not to Europe. And much of that goes by rail. So no, I'm not ready to say that that's a problem for us, that it's an issue we're concerned about. In a context of China practicing dumping and other types of unfair competition in the aluminum sector, inclusively, of course, do you think that Canada's current policy is protecting our producers against such practices? I think that the Government of Canada has, even this summer, taken some pretty strong measures by setting up, for example, a tariff on imports, a 25% tariff on Chinese aluminium. It doesn't export raw metals, but semi-transformed metals. And they are now running up against a tariff wall set up around America. This was the American initiative that got underway this last spring, and Canada got on the bandwagon, as did Mexico. Chinese products can no longer really access, well, they can, but they're no longer competitive here on the current market in America. Rio Tinto sells most of its product to the United States. Yes, that's clear. Yes, we do. They are our neighbors. It's easier to get it there. So pollution pricing mechanisms in the EU, is this an opportunity for our aluminium sector? Clearly, Canada does have a possibility. I mean, logistically, this is possible, technically as well, to export our metals either to the United States or into Europe. So that would be a small percentage, though, into Europe, right? Yes, and I'll explain why. Of what we produce, let's say that we produce 50% of added value and 50% of basic commodities. So the added value is basically what we send to clients. That's the way we talk about it. So it's basically made, it's alloyed in order to meet their needs in a specific context. It's not a product that we can quickly move from one client to another based on market changes because we're creating something for a specific client. But the other 25% can go anywhere and could go to Europe in as much as market conditions favor Europe. When we think this through, we have to see the price paid by the Europeans based on their market dynamic at that time, justifying, sending it to them rather than to the U.S. And that's not the case right now. 20 seconds, yes, left. All right, I wanted to talk to you about the diplomatic approach to commercial negotiations, but
yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for their time today on this very important study as we look at the carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Mr. Sawyer, you had mentioned that Canada has a significant advantage as we have both federal and provincial programs in place to reduce emissions. One of our programs, of course, is our federal carbon pricing, which has already reduced close to 3 million tons of emissions in the last 4 years, which could be, I think it's roughly the equivalent of 11 million gas-powered cars off our roads. Canada leads the way with the largest emissions reduction in the G7. And when you talk about what our country has done and our competitive advantage and bringing together the data, I think you mentioned kind of making sure that both the federal and the provincial governments bring this data together to really help emphasize the actions that we've taken to bring down carbon. But really it helps to attract economic investments to our country. You see billions of dollars, over $50 billion invested in our countries, setting up shop, creating jobs for Canadians. Now, what would you recommend in terms of the data that we share? Is it on the industrial side? Is it on the consumer side? Maybe you can speak more about that.
Sure. In the context of the border carbon adjustment is really about the costs or the carbon charges that that industry is facing, the large emitters are facing, that are subject to the border carbon measures. And so in the country, because most provinces are running their own system and have been, Alberta since 2007 has had their large emitter program. They're running their own system, so they make their own decisions on sort of the share of emissions that are charged, the cost imposed by industry. And when you look at a single sector in the country, it's very fragmented. It's sort of all over the place. And the relative charge paid is a big distribution. So we've got a sort of domestic competitiveness issue, but also we have a problem with sort of saying to the EU or the Americans, hey, this is what we're paying on average. So pulling that information together requires the feds and the provs to work together to basically disclose and collect this information so that we can put it in front of the regulators who are driving these border adjustments.
Thank you for that. And you had mentioned the U.S. bipartisan carbon bill, the Prove It Act, which is put forward by both Republicans and Democrats across the U.S. Can you speak maybe more to this bill so we can all understand, for those watching, what does this mean? I kind of get a general sense it's a bill to look at some of the data, some of the actions that U.S. industry has been taking to lower emissions. So should they have to deal with CBAM in other countries, they have data to kind of prove that they are also going in the right direction.
So in the past, sort of bipartisan bills that have come forward on border carbon adjustments have included a carbon price, which have not really moved forward. And this one is different, Prove It, because it does not include an explicit imposition of a charge on U.S. exporters. What it does instead is it's basically a reporting requirement. It says, hey, cement, Lafarge, you're bringing in cement. You have to, on your bill of lading, meet these reporting requirements. And that rolls out across about 200 products across big swath of our industry. And so it really right now it's an administrative burden, more red tape, but ultimately it's about data collection, and it's a step towards imposing a cost on those imports.
So my guess is the U.S. would use that data to help in their sales pitch with other CBAM countries that, hey, look, we're taking steps to lower the carbon emissions for some of these products that we're looking to export to your country, and therefore maybe we should be excluded from a potential carbon duty on things shipped to the EU. Is that?
Yeah, the regulations are really complex, and I'm not an engineer, so it gets a little scary. But basically, what happens is, what's your emission intensity? Emissions per unit of cement. What's your emission intensity over here in the other country? Emissions per unit of cement. Do you have a carbon price? Differences? We're going to charge you. And so, disclosing your relative emission intensity to the other country, the implementing country with the tariff, that is step one. So you have to be able to demonstrate what you're doing and avoid punitive charges or double counting, paying at home and abroad. So that's really what it's about.
So when you compare to what the U.S. is trying to look at and what Canada's done here with the carbon pricing, would you say we have a good competitive advantage compared to other G7 countries?
Yes, I would say our carbon pricing, I mean, that was the basis of my talk. It's a foundation, right? It applies to the EU, right? So there are companies now in the country who are going to have to basically disclose their carbon content, be assessed against the EU rules today, and then basically disclose what they're paying in provincial or federal carbon charges, and then get levied a fee, and that increases prices in the EU market.
So the work that this government has already done to this point gives us a leg up because we've started long before many of these other countries that may be looking into this. I know I have 30 seconds left. What other countries are looking at a CBAM type similar legislation? I've heard maybe the UK, maybe Australia. Is there other countries that come to your mind?
Yeah, so the UK is looking at implementing it, absolutely, and the Australians are thinking about it as well. I mean, it's an issue, right? Misaligned carbon costs and competitiveness issues are an issue, and that need to be addressed. And CBAM is the tool of choice, so they're not going away.
Absolutely, and we need to level the playing field when you talk about environmental labor standards, as Ms. Kwan said. I know I'm up of my time, but maybe next round.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sauvé, for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question will be for Mr. Simard. We know that Quebec aluminium is one of the greenest in the world. I'd like to have you explain to us, well, actually, give us more details, basically, about how you've gone about decarbonizing from the outset. And I'd also like to hear how we compare to the world average in your sector. Thank you. Let me correct you at the outset, though, because we can't say in Canada that aluminium is green with the Law 59 that came in this year. Saying that would be really greenwashing. That's why we simply say low-carbon aluminium. So that's the way we speak of it, to be accurate. Since 2012, since the carbon pricing systems came in Quebec, we have undertaken an approach in the sector that has led to a rapid reduction of our greenhouse gas emissions. And that being the case, we have signed 2 voluntary agreements to reduce emissions with the government of Quebec, and both times we hit our targets and surpassed them, such that today we are Canada's industrial sector that has, more than any other, contributed to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the country. We produce about 2 tons equivalent CO2 by ton of aluminium that we produce, whereas in India or in China, using coal, emits about 17 to 21 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of aluminium produced. Given our average, we are among the least emission producing compared to everyone else in the world. And considering the pathway to that, for the decades to come, of course, everyone has their pathway 2025 in the industrial sector to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Everyone has that in mind and is planning for it. But the world average, so taking into account what is hydro electricity-based or coal-based or hydro-based, is about 9 tons, and we are at 2 tons. We're where the rest of the planet is aiming for by 2045. So we're really way out ahead. Our challenge now is that further improvement involves changing the very way we make aluminium, and we're aiming for that. I have 2 questions. You mentioned greenwashing, and this I'm curious about. I'd like to know how your members are affected by this bill you mentioned. I found that a little unusual, but then maybe you could tell us as well more about your 2050 challenge, what it looks like. All right, so on greenwashing, there are some terms that should be used correctly. And when I said earlier, green aluminium, we're not using that term. We never have. It's kind of a government talk, if you wish. It's a way of putting it that's easier to understand for the public. It's easier to talk about our green aluminium. At least the public gets it, but we don't use that because it's very relative. You know, in these other places, they could say they are green aluminium because they're using liquid gas instead of using coal now. So it's all very relative. We're concerned because foreign competitors could make representations to the effect that they are green, and it will be very difficult for Canadian authorities to counter that if we're all using the same language, but no one quite knows what it means, or it means different things in different contexts. So applying such parameters, well, it's all very relative, you see. And you need to refer to methodologies that are recognized by all internationally, and that's where it gets difficult. We'll see over time where this goes. We haven't any practices that we're intending to change because we have always documented our positions and our terms and so on very clearly. Second part of your question was about our challenge for 2050. Well, we need to bring in totally new technologies like the ELYSIS project in the Saguenay, disruptive technologies, or bring in even newer technologies that have not been used in our sector. For example, something like carbon capture.
Up. Thank you. On to Mr. Desjardins for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being present with us today. We're studying, of course, the massive economic and trade impacts of climate change. This is a severe topic. We often talk about in this place, and in particular in this committee, we talk about the cost of the very concerning threats of the American elect President Donald Trump, 25% tariff, concerning and deeply problematic. The impacts of climate change, extreme, extraordinary when compared to the tariffs present by the American elect president. So I think it puts into context the very severe reality that we're dealing with, the next generation in particular, young people, young Canadians, young workers that are right now paying into pensions. They're doing the hard work, and they're wondering whether or not their products, the things they're contributing to, the work that they're contributing to, will have value in the future. We heard from forest producers from Quebec, actually, a couple weeks ago, and I asked the question, what is the greatest threat to your industry? He said the wildfires last year shut down the entire forest industry for the entire summer. They generated a huge loss. It's a severe issue, and it's something that we have to take more seriously in this place, and I really hope that we can take the time to speak about why we're having this conversation today. The motion we're debating and we're studying, of course, is demonstrating global leadership on emission reductions, including the use of price on pollution mechanisms that will benefit Canada's trading relationship with the EU and others. It's a positive frame, I'd suggest, to a very serious issue. There are, of course, opportunities given a crisis. We're talking about the impacts of a crisis. Ms. Kwan, you mentioned some of that opportunity. You mentioned one of the recommendations by the Canadian Labour Congress, which I agree with. I've heard it from others as well, including the Alberta Labour Congress, this need for an industrial strategy. How do you think, Ms. Kwan, an industrial strategy will assist Canadians, assist Canadian workers in ensuring that not only are they going to be able to continue to have good union-paying jobs, but able to contribute to a future their children could be proud of?
Thank you very much for your question. I would say unions have been calling for industrial strategy for quite a while now. If you look across the actions that we've been doing, there are parts and pieces and different strategies, but there's no visionary plan that one can actually follow. And I say this because we really need one to provide us with some framework to go forward in. And when I mentioned the industrial policy, in fact, it is in the document that the Canadian Labour Congress had put out last December of 2023, a Sustainable Jobs Blueprint, Part 2, putting workers to and communities at the center of Canada's net zero energy economy. And amongst the recommendations that is economy-focused recommendations is to develop a net zero industrial policy that creates conditions for thriving industries. So, the thing is that I've always felt that we talk about, the work that we do in terms of low carbon economy. And that is really good. But on the other hand, I think that we need to push a little further. And we don't need to always push in the same direction as the United States. We can do our own thing. And one of the things is that there is no reason why, when we produce, one of the cleanest steel, that we can't use it in local public infrastructure. Why aren't we compelling the use of that? Or lumber, local lumber, right? And so this is all part of the rethinking of that needs to go into the industrial policy, just as diversifying the economy. Like we have a very, rip and ship model, which is we rip out the raw stuff, we extract it, and then basically more or less we ship it out. Well, it adds no value to us, and we need to develop those value-added downstream activities to create good jobs. So, I can't go through the whole thing, but certainly that is what is generally meant by that. And we need to create jobs that are not just existing jobs, but you know what? There are new jobs out there, new jobs in the low-carbon economy that, quite frankly, we can't even imagine yet, just as, the development of AI, we can't even imagine yet. So there are new jobs coming up, and we really need to provide the supports for workers that are transitioning over to other sectors, whether they're, traditional ones or whether they're new low-carbon ones, and we also need to provide them with training for upskilling, reskilling, skilling in general.
So in many ways, you're talking about more jobs for Canadians, more good-paying union jobs for Canadians. And I'll give you an example. Precision drillers in Alberta. I used to work in Alberta's oil sector, and this was something that is very common. We have precision drillers, the folks that actually drill the well that we need to get oil out of. These individuals, Precision Driller, for example, one of the largest companies in Alberta, imagine, for example, if they could be utilized, the skill and technology of these workers, and to be rewarded, not just in pride, but also in good paychecks, to then continue and diversify their bids for products. Rather than just an oil company, for example, saying, hey, Precision Drillers, you should build this oil well for us. What if there was another company that said, you should mine, or you should drill a geothermal plant? Imagine if that question was present to them. And as a matter of fact, that happened in 2014 and 15. A pilot project in Alberta converted an abandoned oil well with the existing skills and technology of the oil sector, and they produced the very first geothermal well in Alberta. Is that an example of a kind of technology that not only provides for good union-paying jobs, but also increases and diversifies the immense skill and labor skills and the immense labor skills and technology that we already have.
I'm sorry, Mr. Desjardins, you are 10 seconds over your time.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to it.
Ms. Kwan, I'm sure will find a way to answer that in addition to her answering the other questions. Mr. Genero for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And yes, Ms. Kwan, you're certainly someone who's been in the committee a few times. I'm sure you'll find a way to do that. Welcome back to committee, Mr. Simard. Also, welcome back as well. And Ms. Sawyer, I'm not sure if I've seen you at committee before, but if so, welcome back. If not, welcome. Anyways. I do want to pose a question to all three of you, just kind of first right off the bat. In 2020, this policy was first announced by the current government, and then in 2021, it was included in the government, the Liberal Party platform. And then 2022, consultations were undertaken by the government to do it. First off, were any of the three of you consulted on this as part of those consultations? May I start with you, Ms. Kwan?
I have to say, in the job that I do, we actually keep track of consultations. So, did someone approach us? I can't remember, but I know that, in fact, we did, I did, and the Canadian Labour Congress did have conversations with other unions who were interested in the BCA consultation, yes.
Just to clarify, somebody that either you or somebody that you know had participated in the consultations, basically.
We had a discussion amongst ourselves,
okay.
But it wasn't a face-to-face consultation that I was involved with. It was a consultation that was open for submissions. So we got together.
There's just a lot of mystery around these consultations, so trying to get to it. Mr. Sawyer, did your organization participate?
I'm unaware if we participated. I did not.
Okay. And Mr. Simard.
I just want to make sure I understand the reference. Is it the consultation about the Canadian CBAM? Is that it?
Yes.
I missed that part. I'm sorry.
Yes, you are correct.
Okay. We submitted a brief. We were consulted. We took part in the consultation, the reaching out, and submitted a brief on behalf of the industry.
Okay, thank you. Have you seen any results from those consultations? Again, they happened in 2022.
My understanding, from what I can recall from the consultation, it was an ongoing process.
Just a quick, I'm trying to move on. Yes or no? Have you seen those results? Ongoing or not?
Can't remember if I've seen anything because it was ongoing.
And Ms. Kwan?
No, there was no report.
And I just to help you out, Mr. Simard, that is the correct answer. There has been no results from the consultations. So if you see them, please let us know, because again, this was the government from 2020. We're almost in 2025, and this happened in 2022. And then I'm going to try to get allow my colleague to ask a quick question. But before I do, just want to ask you, Ms. Kwan, a brief question. What are the potential repercussions for workers in the manufacturing and energy sectors if we're not aligned with the United States on trade policies?
I think that any discussion about the United States right now is a little bit up in the air, given that we don't know. I would say that any change in the industry would obviously disrupt jobs for sure, but I would say it's hard to figure out, what even align means right now.
All right, thank you. And then for the last minute,
1
I'll
minute
pass over
and
to
7
Tony.
seconds.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for being with us today. And, just building on what my colleague from the NDP said earlier about, a new severe reality that we're facing. The changes in the United States, for example, with an upcoming administration and a different approach. Mr. Sawyer, you talked about not so much a CBAM, but you talked about the U.S. Prove It Act. Now, what is the status of that legislation? Is it passed? Is it enforced into law?
No.
That was just my question.
Yeah, it's just proposed.
And so has it been introduced and beginning the legislative process?
I believe not.
Okay, thank you.
All right, on to Mr. Arya for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Sawyer, while introducing yourself, you said you're associated with the organization called Environmix.
Yeah, enviroeconomics, yes.
So is that?
Enviroeconomics.
So it is not Environmix?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks. I'll come to you.
Okay.
Ms. Kwan, your recommendation number 1 and 3, I can't repeat it. Are there any countries that have implemented those recommendations?
I would say in terms of industrial strategy, for instance, if you look at Europe, they have strategies around that. They also have strategies around, well, obviously emissions and strategies around deforestation, all of that stuff. And 3, there are many governments who are active in this realm of shifting towards a low carbon economy. Provides
Governments are doing because sometimes it is easier for us to know if somebody else has done that. We can look at how the model works and we can try to copy that. There's nothing wrong in copying good things. Anyway, Mr. Simard, a quick question, a short question. What percentage of aluminum productions from Canada are exported to outside of North America?
A very small proportion, perhaps 3%, 5%, all depending on the year. The rest goes to the U.S.
Okay, basically your concern here is the imports into Canada, right?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Basically here on this particular issue, your major concern is import into Canada. Am I right?
We don't have an issue with imports into Canada. It's not an issue for us.
Thank you. Mr. Sawyer, coming back to you. You said the proposed bipartisan bill that is pending in the U.S., you think it will pass with the Trump administration?
I could not speculate on that.
Because, obviously when a bill like that is passed, that will increase the cost for carbon-intensive industry. With the business lobbies being strong there, I'm wondering whether it will be done. And you said 30% of our products exports will be covered under that, correct, if I'm not wrong?
Yeah, it's a big number, yes.
So is it our advantage if the bill passes?
It is.
Certainly not.
It depends what happens, right? I mean, it really does depend on the final rules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know you did mention the federal and the provincial systems and how reducing emissions and maintaining competitiveness, they do help it. But is it not a problem for some of our sectors?
What, the CBAM?
Yes, ma'am.
The CBAM, is it a problem? Well, it is a problem for our exporters to the extent they get levied. It increases costs, which reduces their market share in foreign markets. So it will be a problem in Europe.
The agriculture sector, who have made Canada the 5th largest exporter of agri-food products in the world. How do you think they are coping up with this?
The fertilizer sector would be the only sector covered under CBAM. And so that they would see an increase in cost to the extent that they're misaligned with the EU. Our Canadian prices, carbon prices, are misaligned with the EU carbon prices. They would face a charge.
Okay, when trading with, say, European Union, it's not a problem because our objectives align. But when it comes to Canada's trading with the Global South, don't you think that our companies, our products will be under competitive pressure?
I don't have a view on that.
Is there any risk that our policies here, the stringent climate policies, they'll be considered as protectionist by those countries who wants to trade with us?
Our large emitter trading programs were likely WTO compliant, so we're okay from a protectionist perspective. The design of these border tariffs is another story. We're not implementing one, so I can't comment. But the WTO will have something to say on these things.
Okay.
Do you
Thank
think,
you very much, Mr. Arya. On to Mr. Sauvé for 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I have two questions for Ms. Kwan of the CLC. Since the outset of this study, we've been discussing the European Union and the United States. We do have other trade partners, though. I'd like to know whether you have any ideas about those to share with us here.
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, and the focus on the U.S. and the EU obviously are obvious. Trading partner number one, trading partner number two. But I would urge the committee to consider the other FTAs that we have with other countries. Oops, sorry, should not address you personally, but like in the global south, for instance, because under the FTAs, every country has their own mechanisms, and under FTAs that we have, for instance, FTAs with Chile, Colombia, Indonesia, Australia, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand, they have some type of mechanism in place, So, whether the border carbon is in or out, the fact is that the basis of it is trending towards that way anyway. And I think that, quite frankly, thinking about having a Canadian border carbon adjustment is about, and I'm not a hockey fan, but literally it's like going where the puck is going and not kind of staring down the U.S. as the only option.
Puis aussi, je voulais savoir, vous avez...
I'd also like to know, earlier you mentioned the rip and ship idea. At the Bloc Québécois, even if I'm an urban MP, we're very interested in what goes on in the regions and the economy of the regions, which can be very beneficial to the overall economy of Quebec. So you, at the CLC, do you have any thoughts about this sort of rip and ship approach to our aluminum, for example?
I think that when, I wouldn't say aluminum. I mean, I know that steel and aluminum, for instance, is very different in the nature of how it's kind of goes back and forth between the U.S. and Canada. So it kind of, that adds another character to the whole thing. But in terms of the rip and ship, for instance, if we're, getting crude out of the ground and we're just shipping it, that's one point of sale, right? If we have a downstream activities to process it a little bit more, to do something more with it, we're creating jobs. And I think that that's what I'm trying to refer to, is instead of just shipping things raw, agricultural products are the same thing. Can we not at least add a few more things in the downstream economy so that we can add value and add good jobs to it before we ship it out? So, it's about thinking through an industrial policy that kind of keeps adding to that growth and keeps adding good jobs to the equation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kwan. On to Mr. Desjardins for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And just to continue on my Bloc Québécois colleagues' line of questioning regarding downstream value-added products. We know that will create good jobs. A good example of that, and Ms. Kwan, this will be for you, would be for forestry, for example. One of the greatest industries in Western Canada. We're seeing serious issues of supply chain resilience because of existing tariffs by the Americans, a dispute that's gone on forever. Would it be important to see within an industrial strategy a target for softwood lumber as an example in this discussion to value add to those products for something like mass timber production that can go into the construction of very high dense residential buildings, for example. And that's just a goal. If the goal is to build more housing in Canada and there's an industrial strategy to get there, it would involve softwood lumber and it would involve making certain that those products could be built here. Is that a good example of what you mean by value-added industrial strategy?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I would give you an agricultural because it gets brought up and doesn't get much time in these things. Is that we can grow a tomato and then put it in a box and ship it out, or we can grow a tomato and make it into something here, and add more jobs. And then we can, in fact, make even more products from that. So, I mean, this is the type of diversification, this is type of downstream economy that really needs to be part of that industrial strategy.
And in terms of job creation, we know that when we don't, oh, sorry, apologies, was that my phone? Oh, okay, sorry. I lost my train of thought, Chair. What was I going to ask? It was a great question. I knew it. It was going to be really good, Ms. Kwan. It was, yeah, exactly. It was jobs. We know that when you have value-added products, it creates good jobs here. If you don't do that, that means those jobs are going somewhere else. Isn't that correct?
Well, absolutely, absolutely. So, for instance, we're trying to really forge ahead with the low carbon economy, kind of, for instance, in critical minerals, which is actually what the EU counterparts were interested in talking about, and all of that. So, I'll give you an example. Indonesia, I believe it's copper. I keep mixing up copper and nickel, but I think it's copper. Copper mining. They used to basically rip it out of the ground and ship it out. Right? And the government actually kind of said, nope, not going to do that. We're going to process it before we ship it out. And they did that with a lot of investment. And in fact, it added billions, tens of billions to the economy because they took one more step in adding one more value.
Okay. Lots more jobs.
And lots more jobs.
Very
Thank
good.
you very much.
Point d'ordre, Madame la Présidente.
Point of order, Madam Chair. Given that we had that Amber Alert over our phones, I would like unanimous consent from the committee to allow my NDP an extra 30 seconds to lose his concentration, as we all did in the middle of his questions.
The clerk adjusted the time for that interference. We try to make sure you get all the time you can get. We have 5 minutes left, and I have Mr. Baldinelli and Mr. Sidhu that are on the last two people. Mr. Baldinelli, do you have a question? Or you for a minute?
Sure. Let me just get back to.
Give you a minute, and Mrs. Sidhu a minute, and will get us to 5:30 for the next panel.
Sure. Thank you. I'll just follow up with Ms. Sawyer, Ms. Kwan, as we had talked about the new reality, which is in the United States in the next couple of weeks, the swearing in of a new U.S. administration. And there seems to be a different approach in the United States we're already hearing of tariffs and the discussions of CUSMA renegotiations. So the question of alignment is kind of critical, I would suggest, about what's happening here in Canada policy-wise with what, is our largest trading partner. We trade more with the United States than we do with the rest of the world combined, right? 31 states are the largest trading partner for Canada. It's incredible. The auto sector. The regulatory harmony that we shared in the auto sector allowed that sector to grow. We had 3 facilities in St. Catharines at one time, employing over 10,000 people. Now we're down to 1 facility, and it only employs just under 1,000 people. My concern is for those jobs in the future and that they continue. And I'd like to Ms. Kwan's point, I'd like to see that grow and continue to grow. So if we're out of step with what happens with our largest trading partner, how are we to then compete?
Ms. Kwan, if you're being directed, I have to ask you for one of those one-word answers for a very long question that was more than a minute, so I can get over to Mr. Sidhu.
Okay. The answer is we don't know what's going to happen, and look towards the states, the other states that have mechanisms that they're applying.
Thank you so much. Mr. Sidhu for a minute, or
Thank you, Madam
minute
Speaker.
and a half to be fair, I guess.
Okay,
Or
thank you.
closer to
Thanks,
2.
Madam Chair. I'll take the minute and a half. And look, I know we're talking about, similar to what the U.S. is doing, we want to be in lockstep. And we've heard about, the U.S. Prove It Act, where, lawmakers down there, Republicans and Democrats, are looking at, industry and the carbon efficiency down there. And this act was supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Iron and Steel Institute, by the American Petroleum Institute. There's many other organizations here that are supporting this act because they know that this gives a competitive advantage to countries that do have carbon pricing mechanisms in place or progressive environmental policies in place. And we hear from the Leader of the Opposition, talking about axing the tax. And since we heard about the platform of 2021, in 2021, the Conservatives did have carbon pricing in their platform, and they just turned around, and this sends a uncertainty to industry partners that are looking to invest in Canada, because we're seen as a progressive partner. Companies are coming here to create jobs, and I think it's very important for committee members and those watching to understand that we have a leg up when we look at the G7. With our carbon pricing, we're actually competitively ahead of many other countries. And so I think it's important, yes, we look at what the U.S. is doing, but you look at down the U.S., this bill was supported by Republicans from Florida, from Indiana, from Oregon, from across the U.S. And so, I don't think this is the end of the line, but I think just a quick comment here, I want to thank Mr. Sawyer for bringing this up, that, the U.S. Prove It Act is just one way that the U.S. is looking at it. And it's a study, and so we'll see where it goes from here. But I do know there's a lot of organizations and institutions down in the U.S. that support it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our witnesses for this first hour of testimony. We will suspend while we switch over to our other witnesses. As an individual, Neil Campbell, partner with Macmillan LLP, And from the Canadian Union of Public Employees, Angela McEwen, Senior Economist, National Services. And from United Steelworkers, Troy Lundblad, Department Leader, Research, Public Policy and Bargaining Support, and Francois Soucy, Legislative Staff Representative, Political Action and Communications. Welcome to you all. We will start with opening. Yes, sir.
Excuse me, Madam Chair, I'm not hearing the interpreter.
Just a second here, and we'll see if we can get our translation. Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This one's broken. I moved it over there. He wasn't there.
Some of those things just don't work very well. I find the volume obviously good. All right. Okay, welcome to you all. We will start with opening remarks. Mr. Campbell, you have the floor for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the invitation to appear before the committee today. I'm a lawyer, and my practice focuses on international trade, as well as competition and foreign investment review. I've previously written and spoken about border carbon adjustments, or BCAs, including the CBAM, from a trade law perspective. My opening comments will focus on 6 brief points about when BCAs may be useful and how they may be implemented. First, in my view, the 2 conditions that make BCAs a potentially important trade law instrument that can benefit domestic producers and benefit the Canadian economy are, number 1, that you have significant carbon costs being imposed on certain domestic sectors, and secondly, that those domestic sectors are facing significant competition in Canada from imported products whose manufacturers basically have an advantage because they incur either low or no carbon costs. Second point, I think the optimal level of a target charge for a border carbon adjustment should match the level of the carbon costs per ton of emissions being imposed on the domestic industry for 2 reasons. First, any higher level is going to invite a trade law challenge for violating the national treatment or the non-discrimination provisions in the WTO and in our other bilateral and regional trade agreements. And secondly, any lower amount is just going to leave Canadian producers on a less than level playing field in their home market. Third point, in my view, it's important to allow in a BCA design for the charges at the border to be reduced when an exporter can establish that it is subject to carbon regulatory costs in its home jurisdiction. Basically, this eliminates the double payment problem or double counting problem, and that problem would be difficult to justify under a national treatment standard. So what you're doing by recognizing those foreign costs is to essentially align the total payment that the incoming product makes to your domestic climate regulation level of choice. And the EU CBAM is using that approach. Basically, you've got verified local carbon costs being offset against the amounts that the exporter would have to otherwise pay purchasing the certificates in the EU's emission trading system. So relative to exporters that are selling into the EU from countries with no carbon regulation, Canadian exporters have a couple of advantages. Size may vary. They're already doing some of the climate measuring, accounting, some of the information type work that was discussed in the previous panel for domestic purposes. To the extent that the EU wants more or different, that adds some incremental challenges, but relative to a no-carbon country, we're ahead of the game. And secondly, we'll pay lower charges into the EU than a no-carbon country. One of the interesting developments since the CBAM has been emerging is, despite China, India, Brazil, and some other countries claiming that they will challenge it from a trade law point of view, they're also actually increasing their efforts to build their own domestic carbon pricing systems in various ways. And the sort of intuitive logic of that is keep the revenue to some degree within your home jurisdiction rather than paying it to the European Commission. Fourth point, the CBAM has attracted a lot of attention. I would encourage you to recognize, and I know it's in your notice of motion, but it's one particular design one particular approach for implementing a border carbon adjustment. There are other options, quite a number of other options, quite a number of design choices. By way of one just quick example that's, I think, particularly important for Canadian producers, the question of exemptions or free allowances in a carbon regulatory regime. Those are often perceived to raise trade law issues for a BCA under a national treatment kind of analysis. And what the EU is doing is making those go away, phase their allowances out. But I think that choice may, in fact, be as much or more driven by the EU's long-term policy, climate policy objectives, rather than just trade law compliance. Put more plainly, I think it's defensible to keep the allowances or exemptions in effect as long as you're setting a border carbon adjustment amount at a level that would reflect the average or the net prices being imposed in the domestic jurisdictions. So, quick example, simplified math, if you're imposing $100 per ton cost on carbon emissions, but the allowances mean that only 75% of the emissions are being charged, then you could impose a border carbon adjustment at $75 per ton of emissions and be treating the foreigners on a level basis in terms of the average cost they're paying being comparable to the average cost you're imposing on your domestic producers. So a BCA would not require Canada to give up its allowances in the OPBS or features of that sort. Necessarily could by choice, but it's not required. Fifth, I do think the regulatory burdens can be a quite important consideration when you're designing BCAs. I think that for Canadian producers, the incremental cost of doing a Canadian BCA is quite low, partly because they're already doing a lot of client measuring and reporting, but in particular because the obligations in a Canadian BCA are not going to be imposed upon the Canadians, they're being imposed upon the foreign exporters or importers. I would quickly reference, I think Ms. Lamoureux said, a lot of focus in monitoring interoperability. Things don't need to be identical. There are mechanisms for mutual recognition agreements and such that could be used.
Thank you
Chair,
very
I
much.
see you're giving me the nod.
Yes.
I have one very
Yeah,
short
Mr. Campbell.
last point.
Committee
which,
members always have lots of questions.
Certainly. My last point is simply to suggest to you that the lead time for developing and testing and implementing a BCA is pretty long. The UK is starting now and looking at 2027. If Canada is starting in 2025, we're probably looking at 2028 or 2029. So I think it's a long view decision, but the time to start thinking about it is now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Campbell. On to Ms. McEwen, please.
Thank you very much. I am here from the Canadian Union of Public Employees. It's Canada's largest union with over 750,000 members across Canada. QP members take great pride in delivering quality services in communities in a broad cross-section of the economy, including energy, utilities, transportation, and airlines. Globally, we're experiencing the unprecedented impacts of climate change, and many of our members are facing this challenge in both their work and home lives. And in a response to this challenge, many nations are implementing strategies to speed the transition to a low-carbon economy, and it is clear that the global economy is moving towards a reality where carbon-based adjustment mechanisms are happening at borders. For Canada, we do have the additional challenge presented by the uncertainties with the U.S. threats of tariffs and the review of CUSMA coming up. It's important to remember that U.S. states and industries may have priorities and approaches that differ from Trump's. So as my colleague said before, it's not clear what being in lockstep with the U.S. actually means right now. Our economy must adapt, though, and be positioned to take advantage of this massive industrial and economic opportunities that are coming with the shift to a low-carbon economy. We can do that through a comprehensive industrial strategy, which means that we're all working together to protect Canada's interests and clearly prioritize the interests of workers, their families, and their communities. A good example of how we have done this already is the way that the transition off of coal energy generation has contributed to cleaner manufacturing in most Canadian sectors, and that gives us an advantage in the current reality. The European Union is Canada's second largest trading partner for goods and services, and they have already implemented a border adjustment tool. This presents the opportunity to develop a robust industrial strategy that diversifies our economy and our trade partners, including a pro-worker agenda. I am also a member of the Canadian-EU Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement Domestic Advisory Group, and as the CLC representative mentioned on our previous panel, our EU counterparts there have expressed their keen interest in purchasing clean products from Canada because of our high labor and environmental standards. So one of the immediate government priorities should be to urgently develop a Canadian border adjustment mechanism that aligns with the EU and the UK CBAMs. This will help us open more doors to trade and good-paying jobs in Canada and help us minimize the impact of unfair trade practices from the US. Particularly in the context of our domestic carbon price and other domestic carbon prices, a CBA will help protect Canadian industries and jobs and reduce global carbon emissions. Such a framework would ensure that foreign producers bear equivalent carbon costs, and it will help prevent unfair competition in our domestic market. It helps level the playing field and ensures that imports accurately price the environmental costs of their activities. This embodies principles that align perfectly with Canada's climate and trade objectives. We know that the cost of inaction is enormous and prevents serious risks. Without equivalent measures, low-cost, high-emission imports will continue to undercut Canadian producers and jeopardize thousands of good-paying jobs. Given the challenges and opportunities that we're presented with, a border adjustment mechanism is a fair and predictable way to keep Canadian companies competitive and keep jobs in our communities. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We'll now open the floor for questions. Mr. Lundblad. My apologies here. Hold on, Mr. Baldwin. Now you just have to hold that question a little bit more. Okay, Mr. Lundblad, you have the floor for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the members of this committee for the opportunity to speak today on this issue. My name is Troy Lundblad. I'm the Department Leader for Research, Public Policy, and Bargaining Support at the United Steelworkers Union. With me, or rather with you, is my colleague Francois Soucy, our Legislative Staff Representative in our Ottawa office. Our union represents over 225,000 workers in Canada and 850,000 members across North America in virtually every economic sector, including steel, aluminum, and manufacturing, sectors globally considered emissions intensive and heavily exposed to trade. Today, I'll focus on proposals to consider the implementation of a Canadian carbon border adjustment. A CBA or a border adjustment, if implemented, would ensure that the price of imported products reflect the same carbon costs as those incurred by Canadian producers. The Steelworkers Union has for many years advocated for the implementation of a carbon border adjustment regime. Particularly in the context of the implementation of a domestic carbon price, carbon border adjustment mechanism will help to protect our Canadian industries, our jobs, and reduce global carbon emissions. And such a framework would ensure that foreign producers bear equivalent carbon costs as Canadian producers, and it would prevent unfair competition in our domestic market. But CBA can and should be used in conjunction with other policy measures to position our industries for a competitive advantage in low carbon production while protecting good Canadian jobs, for example, in steel and aluminum. And the cost of inaction here is enormous and presents some serious risks. Without equivalent measures, low-cost, high-emissions imports will continue to undercut Canadian producers and jeopardize Canadian jobs. Indeed, Canada's steel and aluminum sectors already enjoy a distinct carbon advantage over foreign producers. Our aluminum has the lowest carbon intensity in the world, emitting roughly 1/10 of the greenhouse gases as Chinese aluminum. Our steel industry, particularly our electric arc furnace production, has one of the smallest carbon footprints globally, thanks to advanced technology and access to low emissions electricity grids in Quebec and Ontario. However, it's also critical that a made-in-Canada carbon border adjustment mechanism be designed in a manner that reflects the realities of Canadian industry and our trading relationship with the United States. As the global economy rapidly shifts to decarbonize supply chains, Canada must align its policies to maintain access to its vital markets in the U.S. as well as in the EU. Adopting principles similar to the EU, but not identical in terms of the carbon border adjustment mechanism at the national level, will also help protect Canadian industries and the jobs and communities they depend on. In addition to the design and implementation of a carbon border adjustment, the USW also urges this committee to consider other policies, such as those that promote buy clean public procurement, to prioritize low carbon materials such as Canadian steel and aluminum and infrastructure products. We also must do more to strengthen trade enforcement by giving the Canada Border Services Agency more resources to monitor and prevent the dumping of high emissions imports that destabilize markets and undermine domestic production. So this isn't about greater protectionism, but rather fair competition whilst promoting emissions reduction. All else equal, one of the most significant contributions Canada can make to carbon emissions reduction is to meaningfully reduce the importation of dirty steel and aluminum into our domestic market. A carbon border adjustment mechanism can help to level the playing field, ensure that imports accurately price the environmental costs of their activities. Canada is at a pivotal moment. We need policies that ensure access to key markets without being subject to carbon adjustment, while safeguarding our vital trade relationship with the United States. Our proposals would help grow our industries, secure good, position Canada as a leader in the transition to a low-carbon economy. The United Steelworkers urge you to act decisively to ensure that Canada's industries thrive in a fairer and greener global marketplace. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you very much. So now we're on to Mr. Baldinelli for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for being here today. It's very much an interesting topic that we're looking at. However, I may suggest it's a little outdated in a sense that how things have changed over the last several weeks in terms of a new incoming U.S. administration that will be taking office in January. And there's big unknowns there. I mean, we're already hearing about tariffs on certain items, on certain issues. We're talking about CUSMA renegotiations. I mean, there are issues such as the IRA, $390 billion that was spent by the Biden administration over 10 years was committed. And we've got an incoming president and a previous administration that had no carbon tax in place. So from a regulatory standpoint, I mean, should Canada be out of lockstep with what's going on in the United States? I mean, we just heard from the United Steelworkers about, that fair competition, that competitive, keeping a competitive advantage. So if we do a carbon-based mechanism without the United States, how does that impact Canada? They are our largest trading partner. We trade more with the United States than we do with the rest of the world combined, for example. I mean, when we talk about steel, 50% of our steel is exported to the United States, 0.1% is exported to the EU. So how is it that we can maintain that competitive advantage? First to you, Mr. Campbell.
Thank you for the question. So I think there's competitiveness in our market and competitiveness in the U.S. market for us to think about in terms of our producers. So a BCA helps you to preserve the competitiveness of your domestic firms in your domestic market. So one of the sources of competition in our market that are not paying for carbon right now are most of the U.S. So if you put a BCA in place, that would charge them and level the playing field up to the chosen level of Canadian carbon. In the U.S. market, I think the way we're managing that currently is through the degree of allowances we choose in our system, and that is something you can continue to choose as you go forward. Those are essentially climate policy choices in the first instance, and the role the BCA plays is leveling the playing field. I think that where your question is going is there may be consequences if we were to do that, and I think that's, in the current uncertain environment, a very fair question and issue to consider. I'll try to be brief, but I think the world we're in that you've described is basically you can cave to intimidation, you can negotiate, or you can retaliate. In the first administration, we saw examples of both. In my view, working on a BCA does create an additional element for Canada to think about using in a negotiation process with the U.S. as you go forward.
Well, I mean, Madam Chair, how much time would I have left?
248.
Well, again, it goes back to that regulatory harmony, the notion of providing certainty, for example. Even if we were able to work on certain issues with the United States, for example, on a BCA, we still have the implementation of a carbon tax, for example, that they don't have in the United States. And so that was something that we had on Monday. We had Catherine Cobden of the Canadian Steel Producers, and she said this, quote, "Before we had a carbon price, the steel industry was suffering in our competitive position when we had to compete with unfair traders, people that were dumping into our market. Now we have the added problem of trying to compete with fair traders like the Americans, who are very prevalent. They represent 40% of our import share, and we're competing with them, and they do not have a carbon price. At $80 a ton of CO2 emissions that we are now facing, that makes a significant difference. The issue is that the carbon price will continue to rise year over year. It's gone up in 2023, 2024, and it's going to go up again in April. How is it that we can maintain those jobs in our competitive position, as Mr. Youngblood indicated earlier? I mean, we want to continue to have jobs in the Hamilton steel sector.
I don't want to hog all the answering, but my brief answer would be the BCA would charge the carbon that offsets the advantage that those U.S. producers have selling into Canada.
But what is the reaction going to be?
Agreed. That's the broader question, and I think that's
so would
a
it
Canada
not be better
governmental
So would it not be better
strategy.
then to work in lockstep to have something in harmony with our largest trading partner rather than doing something that would stand out?
So if you're looking at it in terms of negotiation, because Trump will not accept us being in lockstep. The way that he bargains is if you say yes, he asks for more, right? So this is, as Mr. Campbell indicated, this is actually a bargaining chip that we can use, a tool that we can use in those negotiations.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Sidhu, please. Mr. Sidhu for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for being here this afternoon with us as we talk about the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU is bringing in and how we can take next steps. And Mr. Campbell, you had a very good testimony, or your opening remarks. You had mentioned that it's better that we make the investments now rather than paying tariffs to other countries because it puts us into, we're investing in our own country instead of sending that money away to somewhere else. I'm going to turn to Mr. Lundblad, I think, online. I hope I pronounced your name right. You had mentioned it could hurt your industry if it's subject to carbon border adjustments. And it's important that I mention that our government's making investments to help the steel and aluminum industry. We've invested close to $1 billion in Sault Ste. Marie, here in Hamilton, Ontario, close by, for the electric arc to make our industry less carbon intensive. You mentioned that aluminum produced in Canada has the lowest carbon intensity in the world. And so with the carbon pricing in place, we heard from many witnesses on the study already, it gives us a competitive advantage when we compete with other countries that perhaps may produce steel and aluminum. Could you speak to some of this competitive advantage that we have, whether it's in the innovation, whether it's carbon pricing, because more than likely with our carbon pricing in place, we could be exempt from the EU CBAM when it comes into force in 2025.
Sure, yeah. So there's no doubt that Canadian-produced steel and aluminum is among the greenest in the world. It's on par with the United States, and in some sectors even greener than steel and aluminum or steel produced in the United States. Now the issue, we are not opposed to a carbon tax or a price on carbon in the Canadian economy, but what we would like to see is some sort of adjustment at the border, whether that's a carbon tariff or a carbon border adjustment, to ensure that the price of goods, steel and aluminum in particular, but also goods imported into the Canadian market, reflect the same costs that are imposed onto Canadian produced steel and aluminum to ensure a level playing field. Oops, sorry, that was my phone. In terms of exporting to the European Union. In terms of steel and aluminum, which I'm in a best position to speak to, as the previous witnesses had testified to as well, we don't have large amounts of steel and aluminum being exported to the EU, but the United Steelworkers does recognize that other manufacturers are going to be exposed to added costs with respect to the CBAM in the European Union. So there is additional advantages to imposing or implementing a similar program here.
So if they're going to be hit with CBAM, Canadian steel and aluminum, it could be an even bigger market for you if you have a competitive advantage, correct?
It could, in theory. As far as I know, in terms of projections from the Canadian Steel Producers and the Aluminum Association of Canada, there aren't expectations that our exports to the EU are going to increase in any significant way with respect to steel and aluminum. I'm not in a position to speak to other sectors, which are also important to the Canadian economy.
Absolutely. Like you can talk about fertilizer or many of the other sectors that are important to Canada's economy. Mr. Campbell, I know you ran out of time there at the end, but it was very intriguing to me when you had mentioned that it's better that we innovate now than pay this tariff carbon border adjustments to other countries that may perhaps bring them in, whether it's the UK, whether it's Australia or the EU. Maybe can you expand on that? Maybe if you can talk about Canada's competitive advantage at this point in time?
Well, I think in the long term, the trajectory is we're going to see more countries dealing with trade-related carbon measures. A lot of those may be border carbon adjustments, they may be CBAMs, or they may be different models. I think we'll also possibly see the U.S. do something, but it may not be as climate-driven, at least as domestically rooted, let me say that. There's several, there's half a dozen bills in the U.S. already doing, different suggestions before the change in the administration. I think that Ms. Cobden, whose testimony was referred to as talking about carbon intensity-oriented focus. There's another approach about implicit carbon, which is saying we're really actually causing our manufacturers to spend a lot in the U.S. even though we don't impose a price. I think implicit carbon from a trade law point of view is much tougher. I think that intensity-based approaches could work and be married up with charging above an intensity level, and that creates an opportunity for Canada to think about doing a regime that works with Canada's climate policy, maybe with a bit of adaptation, but becomes somewhat complementary to a design in the U.S. rather, even if the U.S. is using a design that doesn't credit others necessarily. So I think we are in a better place as people who have already cracked the tough nut of starting to measure, monitor, report, and price carbon.
I know I have like 20 seconds left, but just a quick comment here. Through what the U.S. is looking at through their Prove It Act, I think what they're trying to see is they don't want to lose market share to other countries, right? And so they said, let's get ready for this. Let's look at the data. What are we doing to lower the emissions produced by some of our manufacturing industries? I think that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get a leg up. And so I think it's important that, we talk about being in lockstep, but they're also knowing that this may be the future, and that's why they're looking at it. And it's a bipartisan bill, by the way, backed by Republicans and Democrats. So
thank you very much.
Not lockstep, but still do things that are complementary.
Yeah.
Sir Sirard Tremblay for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for what they're speaking to us about today. My first question goes to the steelworkers. We have one by video and one in person. You'll decide how you want to answer. You mentioned that the aluminium industry in Canada has the lowest carbon intensity of any such industry in the world. So that's, of course, due to the electricity used in Quebec. But let's look at the mechanism we're discussing here, which you seem more or less in favor of. How could it help competitively for Quebec producers? Thank you. Thank you for the question, Mr. Savard-Tremblay. Well, look, it's about really taking advantage of a competitive advantage that we already have in Quebec, indeed in Canada, thanks to our electricity, our energy source. that we have the lowest carbon emissions, at least among the lowest in the world for this sector, protecting Quebec workers and so on. You mentioned earlier in your questions to other witnesses that you do support keeping people employed in Quebec and jobs in Quebec. There are communities across Canada that survive thanks to specific sectors, and we want to put those sectors forward. We want to support them and keep jobs in Canada. We want to make the most of a clean aluminium in Quebec and, of course, protect communities and the jobs. Of course, one of the dangers, one of the risks, and we can see this in the news, the tariff threat and so on, the whole dumping issue. It's a very real phenomena. And what's missing to ensure that border services can really watch for that and prevent it? Do we need more resources, more investments? Yes, indeed. That's something that we put forward. The border carbon adjustment is one tool, among others. If we use tools like that to protect our jobs here, then you need to be able to really carry through on that. There's the 25% tariff on steel and aluminium. We worked hard on that, the steel workers, to really counter Chinese dumping. We asked to extend that as well to protect jobs, basically, in steel and aluminium. If we don't know, though, if we don't give border services the way to know where steel is from when it comes across the border, then we'll have a problem. It's all very well good to say that you've got these tariffs and so on, but there's so many ways of countering them, of getting around them, and getting your steel or aluminium in here no matter what. And sometimes it's from China, and that's really carbon intensive when it comes in from China. So that would be contradictory to what we're trying to do. Recently as well, we've seen some new country rules in countries that melt and pour, that basically pour steel. There are a lot of different ways that they're using to really get around the rules. We need to ensure that Border Services really has the means to counter this. You've said that there have been studies on these countries, China, India. I imagine there are lists of these countries. I haven't the full list, but they're up on a Canadian government site, the Department of International Trade. I saw that up there recently, but I don't have them by memory. But there certainly are many countries. Thank you for drawing our attention to that. We could certainly check that out ourselves. This said, all right, so inappropriate resources, not enough investment, traceability, would that be helpful? Well, it's not only HR, it's also technologies that we could invest in to encourage tracing. Could you also tell us something about the relevance of a potential buy green policy? What role could it play? That's another tool that we're asking for. We're asking the government to start using that. We don't think it suffices that the government, is investing in infrastructure, public infrastructure, and sometimes brings in the steel and aluminium from other countries, from places that really have very poor environment and labor practices. So we would like to ensure that we buy green here in Canada, and that would be very useful for our sectors.
Aviez-vous autre chose à ajouter?
Anything else to add? A point you'd like to speak to us about? Your choice. Thank you. I'd just like to thank you for the questions. They were all very relevant.
Desjardins for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to my colleagues for being present. It's always a really fantastic opportunity when we have many labor representatives to help us talk about this. Of course, Mr. Campbell, it's always good to have an expert mind on this as well, and so I thank you all for being present on this issue. I think we all agree in many ways that the most important piece to this is protecting Canadian jobs. I think that's a really important piece to this, and I think that's the frame you're all coming from, and I appreciate that frame. I appreciate that frame because we have serious issues, both the climate crisis, but also, of course, potential tariffs. Softwood lumber is already, facing some of these tariffs. So I'd like to get your perspective on the recommendation by Ms. McEwen related to why Canada should have a CBAM. And it's an important question because I think it can very easily take a different approach. There's a couple of steps to understanding, I think, why CBAM is important, just to try to wrap some of the conversation up from my former colleague from the Conservative bench's perspective, to try to answer some of those questions. I think his question deserves more time, and I'd like to ask all of you, starting with Ms. McEwen, why that is a fair request and fair recommendation for this committee and for our report to study as a means to both protect Canadian jobs, protect our industries, but in particular to ward off potential threats.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's really important to understand what a CBAM does, or what that mechanism does. Globally, many different countries are working towards trying to move to a low carbon economy that often includes pricing or border adjustments. Canada has domestically a price, which adds extra costs, but it also means we've got much cleaner production. So when we're importing from countries that haven't done that yet, they aren't having to pay the full cost of their environmental damage. So the CBAM applies that cost to level the playing field domestically, right? And it also, if we're monitoring and measuring, as some of the previous witnesses have said, it allows us to be compliant when countries do bring on a CBAM, so that we aren't then, our industries aren't paying that additional cost when they go overseas. So this helps protect domestic jobs. This helps protect industries in a global world where people are moving to price carbon.
Mr. Campbell?
I think I said it in my opening, but just briefly, the two situations that drive you to want it are you've got significant carbon costs for your domestic producers. Once you're at that level, if you've got sectors that are facing significant imports who are enjoying an advantage basically from not paying that same carbon, that's what makes it sensible. And I think that's sensible regardless of where the source is coming from, and it relates to jobs and Canadian companies and production and plants and so on. It's a level playing field point.
Steelworkers?
Yeah, and I think in general, the CBAM can serve three main purposes. So my colleagues have already identified the leveling of the playing field to ensure that foreign producers are paying the acceptable costs of the carbon that they're producing and exporting into the Canadian economy. But the carbon border adjustment also prevents carbon leakage. It imposes costs on imports equivalent to carbon pricing faced by domestic producers, and it reduces incentives for producers in Canada to relocate that production to high emissions or other foreign markets. So in that sense, it prevents leakage both in terms of carbon, but also in terms of leakage of Canadian jobs overseas. And then finally, a carbon border adjustment, if implemented properly, should encourage action globally on climate. It encourages exporting countries to adopt or enhance their carbon pricing or emission reduction measures if they want to have access to our markets. So I think it serves those three key purposes.
No, and I think that's a fantastic perspective. I share it with all of you, of course. My concern in some part is looking at the domestic framework that already exists. There's a lot of analytics that go into the monitoring and even the declaration of companies for how much carbon they're producing, being transparent with that. That's a lot of hard work that now is already there. That's part of the really valuable piece to this, I think. And Mr. Campbell, I think, really hits that point home. I want to focus now on what is, I think, an important another reason why, which is the fact that the reason why we have carbon pricing to begin with in many ways is because the cost of the crisis is so great. If we could all, of course, just do away with the climate crisis, we would have. Everybody here would have just said, you know what, okay, if there's no climate crisis, we'd have no price on pollution, we have no price on anything, and that would be a kind of world that some people, I think exists. But the reality is we don't live in that world. We live in a world where carbon emissions are harming our industries. We heard from forestry, for example, that they had no revenue in Quebec last year because of wildfire stopping them. That is a greater impact. It's a huge impact to the livelihoods, well-being of those in Quebec and those across forestry. So this is a part and parcel, part of a plan, I'd say, somewhere within the alphabet of the ABCs that need to be done, not just to combat the climate crisis, but it's part of protecting our industries in a long-term perspective. And so is that, maybe I think, is part of the piece that's missing in this conversation, I think. And would anyone want to comment on why that's a critical piece to this?
A very brief comment, please.
If I could just borrow from what Elizabeth Kwan said in the previous panel, you want to skate to where the puck is going. And this is where the puck is going. And an industrial strategy that recognizes that and puts in place the supports that we need to get there is how we're going to be successful and weather the storm.
Thank you very much. Mr. Genero for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, everybody, for taking the time on a Wednesday evening, right before kind of we break, to be here with us today. I guess maybe get a bit of clarification. I'll start with you, Mr. Campbell, and then maybe on to you, Ms. McEwen, on some of your comments earlier, and I guess cutting right to it. Would you, Mr. Campbell, support the government enacting these measures unilaterally without the United States and Mexico following suit?
I think that it's going to make sense to be developing this in parallel with the negotiation strategy around the CUSMA, and to have the opportunity to decide whether to go ahead without or to do something that may introduce very interesting possibilities in that negotiation. One of the possibilities is the U.S. wants to do something that blocks carbon beyond a particular standard. They may do something that turns out to be not WTO compliant. We might decide to do something that still aligns to some degree that could be WTO compliant. I'm talking about, for example, a standard plus a price associated where we're treating the all domestics and foreigners on a level playing field basis, even if they chose not to do that. It's conceivable, I don't guarantee this would work, but it's conceivable to do a bilateral or regional trade agreement that might have some specific different treatment. So this could be the subject of a negotiated resolution vis-a-vis the United States and Mexico in a CUSMA negotiation that might be different from what Canada would do elsewhere. That's tricky, but not out of the question from a trade law point of view.
I think I want to get back to some of that, but I'll quickly give Ms. McEwen an opportunity to respond first, and then from there.
Yeah, I think what I was recommending was that you go into the negotiations open to the possibility of trying to have the CBAM, trying to make that level playing field. That's the goal with trade negotiations, is to try to create a level playing field. And so I think it makes sense to go in there and have that as part of the
going
conversation
into the trade negotiations, trying to convince the new administration that CBAM is a good idea. That this is part
of our policy, yeah.
And do you think that's successful?
Yeah. Yes.
You think that will be successful in negotiation?
To include it in the toolbox of negotiations, yes. Which is different than unilaterally going forward with something, right?
Right, I understand that, but I guess the question is, do you think that approach would be successful with the new administration?
I've already answered it, yes.
No, you said it's part of the toolbox, yes.
Yes.
But then do you think this particular policy will be successful with the new administration?
I think having it in the toolbox will result in a more successful negotiation.
That's your testimony, that you think this is possible to move forward in the Trump administration. I'm not sure what part is
confusing to you, sir.
I'm trying to clarify with you,
I
Ms.
said
McEwen.
yes.
So you said yes, that this should be in a toolbox. I'm asking
and that having it in the toolbox will result in a more successful outcome in the negotiations, yes.
No, I'm trying to simply ask you a question, Ms. McEwen. I don't think there's no undertone in terms of trying to get this as a partisan approach. I just feel that this is...
I didn't suggest there was.
Let's just keep going.
Well, I guess it's... I would love to hear CUPE's response to this, and maybe we could ask for a response in writing on this particular approach, because obviously not getting a response back. So, Mr. Campbell, I'll go back to you on this. I think that some of your comments about this being a future where there's a parallel conversation about CBAM and then also a trade agreement, are you suggesting that we should work on the CBAM policy piece at the same time as we're doing a CUSMA agreement, and then depending on what happens with the CUSMA agreement, pivot or not pivot, and then if it's unsuccessful, then scrap CBAM?
I think you should certainly be working on it in parallel. It gives you optionality.
So your testimony too is that we start now on a lot of this, and if we were to start now, then you would have 2 or 3 years out on this particular policy, based on what you saw with the European Union. Would that not then, I guess, like as part of the CUSMA agreements, that's then you're playing a long game on this, and ultimately you're looking at perhaps a potential second administration that you're dealing with when this were to come into force. Would that not be correct?
Brief response, if possible, please.
It could be before we're done. It's a long process, but you're obviously starting the big development early on, and you go as you go, right? This is a very unpredictable environment.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Sheehan for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much to all our presenters. It was very informative testimony thus far. And I just wanted to, Manny had mentioned about the investments that we're making in the electric arc furnaces that were identified as being much lower intensity with carbon. In Sault Ste. Marie, $420 million investment that's going to, when the project's done, reduce the emissions by 70%. It's like taking 1 million gas-powered cars off the road. And it's generational funding, because as the world changes, and we asked the Canadian Steel Producers Association, why did they make these, the steel industry, we asked Catherine Cobden, why did they make these investments? So that's where the market's going. So this is the path that we're on. And my questions are to, first, the United Steelworkers, is listening to your testimony and listening to Marty's testimony previously, to take a look at the CBAM as a possible way to help us continue to stop the cheap Chinese dump steel. Because we've put 25% on, which is lockstep with the Americans right now, but potentially, and I'd like you to explain that, a CBAM could then perhaps put another layer of protection?
Yes, I think so. And I think it's important to give credit where credit is due in terms of recent policy initiatives taken by the government, including the Section 53 tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum, improved monitoring at the border, although we think we could do more there and devote more resources there, and also the move in November to implement melt and pour requirements on imported steel, and also it seems that there's movement to smelt and cast requirements on aluminum. There was recently a consultation there. So these are all things that we can do to protect our domestic industry vis-a-vis the most significant threat in steel and aluminum, which is excess capacity in the global market and the dumping and trade circumvention from Chinese sourced in China with respect to steel and aluminum. So moving to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, look, we recognize, as our colleague Mr. Desjardins had stated, something does need to be done in terms of carbon mitigation and addressing climate change. However, we have to ensure that our domestic producers aren't unfairly treated vis-a-vis foreign producers that are producing dirtier steel. It's counterproductive if we put a price on carbon in our domestic market for domestic producers and don't put a similar price to ensure fair competition in our market and reduce carbon leakage. So.
And I think another advantage too as well, just being from a steel town, born and bred all my life, and have relatives that worked in the coke ovens. My brother-in-law's dad worked there, and they used to get extra pension credits because working in the coke ovens with the carbon, it's hard on the body. And, it's not only good on this macro sense, but good for the workers, like the everyday worker that goes into work, goes home and, I know there's a lot of what the steel workers are doing, representing some of the workers that have these cases that are related to some health. So I just wanted to make that point too as well, and thank you. So Angela, the comment that you made, I was thinking that after Trump was elected, and I was mentioning to some of our trade officials because I didn't know about the CBAM, you know, which way it could go or not. I was looking forward to the study. But what you said, this will give us a potential chip on the table in negotiations. Could you please elaborate on that just for us again about this chip that could be worth something?
Sure. So when you're negotiating with someone, so unions often negotiate, right? It's a big part of what we do. And when you're going into negotiations, you don't necessarily take difficult things off of the table before you get to the negotiations, right? You want to keep all of the bargaining chips that you could possibly have in your toolbox so that when they're asking you to give something up for something that you want, you have something that you can give up, potentially. But you also want to be working towards this longer-term goal where you're normalizing the idea that that carbon price fairness, leveling the playing field, is something that we want long-term.
And just very briefly, and if you could submit in writing, you know, Europe brags that labor unions were born there during the Industrial Revolution. Has the European Union done any kind of analysis on what the CBAM would do for workers? And if you have anything, like, just send it in writing because we don't have time to discuss it.
Absolutely. I can check with our European counterparts on the CIIT DAG and get that to you.
It'll help us think.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Sir Savard Tremblay for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Ms. McEwen. You are aware, I imagine, of the carbon exchange mechanism set up between Quebec and California. It's a system that you're well aware of. Good. So the mechanism we're discussing now, how could it be linked into the Quebec system?
Interesting, and I actually don't have that expertise. I'm sorry.
Est-ce que quelqu'un d'autre aurait une idée?
Does anyone else here have an idea? Someone from the union, Mr. Campbell?
I'm not a climate policy expert, but I will offer a couple of comments. From a trade law perspective, there is, if you're doing a border carbon adjustment, there is no reason why Canada could not recognize carbon that is priced in the U.S., in the California system or the other dozen or so states. And so we could use that as part of a border carbon adjustment mechanism. From our point of view, from trade law point of view in Canada, keeping national treatment in mind, we need to probably work to charging a border carbon adjustment that reflects the federal benchmark, because foreigners will be entitled to national treatment, the best treatment of anybody in Canada. So we probably wouldn't gear precisely to Quebec, which doesn't mean it wouldn't be close. We just work off of a federal minimum standard, if I could put it that way.
Mais est-ce que je comprends quand même?
Okay, but I understand that you think that the Quebec-California carbon market could be an inspiration for the rest of Canada.
Again, I'll confine myself to the trade law aspects of it, and it's potentially
J'ai vu Madame McEwen hocher de la tête pour y...
I saw Ms. McEwen nodding. Could you just tell us that that was a yes?
Of course, because it's a proven market, it could certainly be used as an example for something that's been successful in leveling the playing field between trade partners.
You have 25 seconds.
Si le syndicat veut ajouter quelque chose.
If the union has anything to add.
Very much, Mr. Desjardins.
Votre micro n'était pas ouvert quand vous l'avez.
Fait que pour le procès verbal.
Oui.
So, for the record, all's well.
Mr. Desjardins?
I agree with you for the record.
Very much, Madam Chair, and I do appreciate the comments from my Bloc Québécois colleague. It is a very interesting question, and one I think that we'll have to probably, to the chair, maybe review sometime in the future as it relates to the studies, the Quebec existing model, and the integration potential. I think that's a large enough question, but I'm besides the point, and I digress. I want to get to this to really hammer down in our recommendations the importance of the CBAM as a tool in the toolbox for Canadians. It's true that it's on the backstop of a climate crisis. We need a kind of carbon pricing in the country. You know, New Democrats in particular, we're concerned about the type of carbon pricing that exists in Canada today, but largely we accept the principle of carbon pricing as it needs to hit and most particularly look at the highest emitting producers, the highest emitting industries. That's where we believe carbon pricing is most effective. But if that's going to exist, of course, where it's up against a backdrop of policy alternatives. The other alternative, of course, is the conservative position, which is to not have a carbon pricing mechanism in Canada. These two positions, on one side, in my perspective, the conservative proposal would result, obviously, in a larger acceleration of the climate crisis. Maybe it'll be multiple seasons where the forestry industries in Quebec don't have any harvest ability. It may be multiple seasons where we have huge impacts to agriculture. Maybe multiple seasons, rather than regulate or try to attempt to regulate the immense emissions coming or that are being polluted into our atmosphere. Those two positions are really ones that I think Canadians are really stuck between right now. What is your advice to Canadians when they hear these two kinds of solutions, and what would it mean for their jobs? What would it mean for their future? McEwen.
That's also a very big question. I think that certainly you can try to make the carbon price more fair. You can try to make it more effective. But globally, we are moving towards pricing carbon. And so if we were to get rid of a carbon price in Canada, that means that our exporters will be penalized for that globally, likely, right? Where they're paying carbon border adjustments in other places. When we have an industrial strategy that recognizes that this is where we're moving, we can support those industries in making the transitions that they need to make, whether that's with research and development or whether that's an investment in infrastructure that will help them reach their goals. Then that is how we keep these good paying jobs in Canada. That's how we go on this more successful path where we are both reducing climate emissions and protecting industry and jobs in Canada.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses for the valuable testimony and to members. We have no meeting on Monday, just so if everybody recalls that from last week. And I wish everybody a very Merry Christmas. Everybody should get a good rest and come back ready to battle the world in 2025. So, meeting adjourned. Thank you.